The mountain has a way of speaking to those who are willing to listen, and perhaps that is why the story of a man who shaped his own destiny from the forgotten bones of a shipwreck continues to echo across the cold Alaskan winds. When I first came across his tale, I felt something stir inside me, a quiet recognition of the solitude he embraced and the fierce sense of purpose that guided each. There is a kind of person who does not simply run from the world, but walks toward the quiet that waits beyond it, and that is precisely the kind of man he was. His days began in a silence so dense it felt like a blanket laid over the land, and his nights were illuminated by stars close to touch. People often imagine Alaska as a place where only hardship grows, but he saw something different in it. He found peace in the deep, wide stretches of snow, comfort in the sigh of the spruce trees, and direction in the sharp cry of the distant peak, the same peaks that watched over him as he worked, hunted, and learned to read the language of the wild. He had come to live with the mountain not because he needed to escape, because it called to him with a voice older than memory. His connection to that place formed a kind of bond that no ordinary person could fully understand unless they too had walked through the vastness with only their own breath for company. It was on a late autumn morning that he first stumbled upon the remains of the shipwreck, a broken carcass of wooden ribs and rusted metal, half buried under a crust of frost at the edge of a narrow cove. Most people would have looked at that scene and seen nothing more than a piece of history left to rot under the relentless weight of time. But he saw potential, he saw tools, he saw possibilities. It takes an uncommon kind of mind to look at destruction and imagine creation. Yet he carried that gift the way others carry instinct. The wind off the water bit at his face as he studied the ruins, running his fingers across the corroded scraps as if they could speak to him about their former life. He believed that every object had a story, and every broken thing held a secret waiting to be reshaped by hands that respected its past. The beams were cold and wet, the metal encrusted with salt, but he recognized the strength still locked inside, strength he knew he could bring back to life. The mountain had taught him that nothing is ever truly lost if you know how to look for its promise beneath. That morning, as the tide murmured against the shore, he sensed that the wreck had come to him for a reason. His cabin stood several miles inland, tucked between tall trees that shielded it from the winds that rolled down from the ridges. Inside, his tools were arranged calm, orderly, that spoke louder than any words about who he worked slowly, deliberately, allowing the rhythm of the mountain to guide his hand. When he brought the shipwreck scrap into the cabin, he felt a spark of purpose ignite in him, one that would accompany him through long nights of shaping, heating, cooling, and shaping again. Crafting a rifle from those remnants was not an impulsive act, but a response to something he felt deep in his chest, a calling to create something worthy of the land he lived in. He believed that the mountain appreciated effort, patience, and grit, and so he poured all of him into that. Every stroke of the file, every measured tap of the hammer, every moment spent weighing balance and imagining the recoil was part of a conversation between him and the wilderness, not a battle, but a negotiation built on mutual. What made this man different from others was not simply skill or resourcefulness, but the quiet certainty with which he carried him. He never doubted the path he had chosen. He never questioned whether the solitude was too heavy, too cold, too harsh. He loved the mountain as deeply as some love another person, with loyalty, reverence, and a kind of devotion that made every hardship feel meaningful. When the storm winds pushed snow against his door, he saw beauty in the swirling white. When the river froze thick enough to mute its own voice, he admired the stillness. And when he set out to hunt, gather, or mend what the seasons wore down, he did so with a steady calm that only grows in someone who truly belongs. That same calm filled his cabin as he shaped the rifle, whispering through the cracks in the wood, reminding him that creation takes time and patience, but the mountain rewards those who bring their whole heart to their work. The days stretched into weeks as he labored, the rifle taking form piece by piece. He worked without hurry, listening to the groan of the pines, the distant howl of wolves as he carved the stock, polished the barrel, and tested every part with meticulous care. To him, the rifle was more than a tool. It was a promise, a testament to the idea that a man can build what he needs with his own hands if he is willing to give enough of himself in the process. And though he never doubted his ability, he respected the complexity of what he's created. Firearms were not common toys to him. They were extensions of the mind, spirit of the one who crafted. The mountain demanded accuracy because the wilderness forgive careless. As he worked, he thought about the life he lived, the choices he made, and the quiet satisfaction he felt each time he woke to see another morning fog drifting through the spruce. He realized that many people would not understand why someone would choose to live so far from the noise of the world. Did not their understand. He needed only the quiet certainty that this is where he belonged, and every day he lived in the place confirmed it. He carried a deep contentment that came from knowing he had shaped his existence according to his own, not the expectations of others. The rifle he forged from the shipwreck scrap became a symbol of that deeper truth, a reminder that even broken remnants can become something strong and useful when placed in the... When at last he completed the rifle, the mountain seemed to greet it as if it had always been meant to exist. The balance perfect. The weight felt natural as grip. The metal, once corroded and forgotten, now gleamed with quiet dignity, as though grateful purpose it had been given. And though he never hunted for glory or for trophy, he understood that a rifle crafted with such devotion deserved to be tested in a moment worthy. He did not know then that a moment would arrive sooner than he. But the mountain has its own way of arranging, often unannounced and always meaningful. The encounter that followed would become a testament not only to the friendship of the rifle, but to the harmony between the man, the land, and the life he had embraced. And as I tell you this story now, you might find yourself thinking about choices you have made, the moments when you felt the pull toward something quiet, stronger, or more honest. Perhaps you have felt the desire to step away from the noise for a while, or wondered what it might be like to build something with your own hands that stands as firm as the land itself. If any part of this story stirs something in you, even a small spark, then maybe you already understand more than you realize. And before we go any further into the journey of this man and the mountain that shaped him, I would like to know simple from you. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. He often said that a man does not disappear into the mountains without carrying a constellation of memories on his back. And perhaps that is why the silence of that place fit him so well. His past was not something he ran from, but something he carried with the same calm steadiness with which he carried water from the creek or firewood from the ridge. People from the outside world sometimes imagine that a solitary man must be burdened by sorrow or regret, but the truth behind his isolation is much more human than that. He had lived a life full of noise, full of people pulling him in different directions, full of expectations that never aligned with the way he wanted to breathe. He grew up in a place where every neighbor knew his name, where every decision was weighed against the opinions of others, and where the constant hum of ambition made it hard for him to hear his own thoughts. His father had been a fisherman, a man hardened by cold seas and relentless winds, someone who taught him how to work with his hands and how to respect the forces stronger than any man. But his father also taught him something else, something that would follow him into adulthood like a soft echo. He taught him the value of quiet. He remembered sitting beside the old man on calm nights when the water reflected the moon as if the world had been folded into a mirror. listening to him say that silence was the absence of sound, presence of and even as a boy, he felt something awaken in those moments, a longing for the kind of quiet that could settle deep inside a person. As he grew older, the world around him became louder, more demanding, and more tangled with expectations. People mistook his calm nature for indecision, his preference for solitude for strangeness. He worked many jobs and lived in many places, but no matter where he went, he felt the same heaviness slowly building in his chest, like a reminder that he was walking through a life that did not quite belong to him. Some people thrive in crowds and conversations, finding energy in the proximity of others, but he was not one of them. He felt his energy rise only when he stood under an open sky or when he heard the wind move through the trees. There were relationships along the way, brief connections that flickered and faded, not because he lacked care, but because every time he tried to explain the world he longed for, the world of silence and self-reliance, he saw confusion in the eyes looking back at him. He realized eventually that he could not keep living a life defined by compromises he never wanted to make. It was during one particularly restless season that he made the decision to leave, not as an escape, but as an alignment with something he had always known was waiting for him. He remembered standing at the edge of a river one early morning, watching the current slide past him in a slow silver ribbon and feeling a certainty settle in his bones. That was the moment he decided he would build a life defined by his own rhythm, not the rhythm pushed upon him by the world. He sold most of what he owned, packed the essentials, and headed north toward Alaska with a kind of peace settling inside him that he had not felt in years. People asked him why he would choose such a place, why he would leave behind comfort and familiarity. But he never needed to justify his choice. The mountain had been calling him long before he ever saw it. When he finally arrived, when he first walked into that vast landscape and breathed the cold air that tasted like claret, he understood that he had come home. Once he built his cabin and began shaping his days around the season instead of clocks, something inside him settled into place. He woke early, not because an alarm told him to, but because the forest whispered the day was beginning. He gathered wood, tended the fire, listened to the distant crack of ice, and felt a sense of belonging expand through him like warmth. The mountain did not ask anything from him except honesty. He did not need to impress it, did not need to explain himself, did not need to pretend to be anything other than exactly who he was. And that simplicity liberated. He had known many people's past, good people, noisy people, restless people, but none had given him the deep sense of companionship that the mountain offered without single. There were moments, of course, when memories drifted through him, snow, the wind, not painful memories, but reminders. He thought sometimes of the people he once cared about, of the conversations that had shaped him for better or worse, and he held those memories without bitterness. They were part of his path, but they were not his destination. He had chosen a life where each day felt like an honest reflection of who he was. He never felt lonely, because loneliness is the absence of connection, and his connection to the land around him was stronger than any crowd could ever offer. When he walked through the forest, he felt the pulse of the earth beneath his boots. When he watched the northern lights dance across the sky, he felt as though the universe itself was speaking in color. When he sat beside his fire at night, listening to the crackle of burning logs, he felt a sense of contentment so complete that he knew he had made the only decision that ever truly made sense for him. The shipwreck scrap that would one day become the rifle represented far more than materials to be reshaped. It symbolized the idea that even a life that seems broken or misplaced can be reforged into something strong and purposeful When placed in the right environment, he saw that reflection in himself as he worked. Just as he shaped the metal, smoothing its edges and forming its strength, the mountain shaped him in return. The cold sharpened his instincts. The silence refined his thoughts, carved out the unnecessary, and left behind only what was essential. People who visited him occasionally, hikers or hunters passing through, often asked him how he could stand to live so far from the world. He always answered with the same gentle certainty. He was not far from the world. He was exactly where he belonged. He did not miss the noise he had left behind. He did not long for the conversations or the expectation, hurried pace of city days. The mountain taught him that life does not need to be complicated to be meaningful. It needs only to be true. And his truth was written in the snow-covered ridges, the quiet forest, in the frozen rivers that stretched across the land like veins. His isolation, a cave, sanctuary. He felt alive there in a way he never had before. The storms that battered his cabin did not intimidate. The long winters, each hardship was a reminder. Strength grows not from comfort, but from challenge. The past he carried with him was not a burden, but a foundation. It gave him the wisdom to appreciate the life he had built and the clarity to understand why he had chosen it. And as he continued working with the shipwreck metal, forging each piece with care, he felt a quiet gratitude for the journey that had brought him to this moment, gratitude for the noise he had left behind, because it taught him what kind of silence he needed, gratitude for the people he once knew, because they highlighted the kind of solitude he cherished, gratitude even for the confusion and the restlessness that once filled him, because without them, he might never have sought the peace he now lived within every single. His story reminds those who hear it that a person does not have to fit into the world they are born into. They can shape their own path, carve their own life, and build their own peace. And even if others do not understand that choice, the mountain does. It welcomes those willing to meet it with honesty, patience, and heart. As you listen to this journey unfold, if you feel even a small part of yourself resonating with that desire for stillness or clarity, or a life built by your own hands, then know that you are already closer to understanding him than most ever will. And before we move deeper into the challenges and revelation that shaped the rest of his story, if you have felt connected in any way to what you have heard so far, consider subscribing so you can continue traveling with us through each step of this journey. Life in the mountain is measured not clocks or calendars, but by the quiet rhythms that weave through each day. And for him, those rhythms felt like the truest language he had ever known. The silence that wrapped around his cabin each morning was not empty, but full of meaning, a silence that held the rustle of distant branches, the shifting breath of the cold air, and the subtle pulse of a world that moved at its own pace. When he woke before dawn, he would sit for a moment, listening to the faint crackle of the fire settling in the stove, the wisp of wind brushing along the outer wall. Those sounds were enough to remind him that he lived in a place where every moment carried its own purpose and its own quiet gift. He stepped outside most mornings without speaking a word, letting the cold bite gently skin as if to greet him. Snow beneath his boots sometimes crunched, sometimes hushed itself under a thin layer of frost. And as he stood there, breathing in a world untouched by hurry, he felt at ease, settled. His days were simple in structure but rich in experience. He liked to begin with small tasks that grounded him in the flow of the morning. Sometimes it meant splitting wood, sometimes checking the traps he set along the tree line, and other times simply walking the perimeter of his land, noting the new tracks left by fox or moose during the night. The forest around him was never still, even when the air felt motionless. Every tree, every drift of snow, every tiny shift in the wind carried hints about the changing season. He understood those signs the same way others understand familiar voices. He could tell when a storm was forming long before it's gathered, could sense when the wolves were migrating through distant ridges even before he saw prints, and could interpret the subtle fragrance of sap and thaw as early announcements of spring. These small observations were not tasks to him, but companionship, reminders that even in solitude he was part of a larger living world. Inside his cabin, the silence was warm rather than cold. The walls glowed softly with the light of the fire. The familiar scents of burning wood, old leather, and pine resin created an atmosphere of calm that embraced him each time he stepped through the door. His tools hung neatly where he could reach them without searching. He took pride in that sense of order because it reflected the clarity he found in the wilderness. When he cooked, the sound of boiling water or frying meat felt like music woven into the quiet. He liked to prepare meals slowly, cutting meat with careful precision and seasoning his food sparingly so that nothing overwhelmed the taste of what the land had provided. His meals were simple, hearty, and honest, much like the life he had chosen. As the months passed, he developed a deep appreciation for the silence that filled his days. It was not the sort of silence that isolates a man, but the kind that allows him to hear the smallest truths inside himself. In the city, silence was something people feared because it exposed the thoughts they tried to outrun. But here, in the vastness of Alaska, silence was a companion that soothed the mind and sharpened the senses. It gave him space to think, to breathe, to understand the rhythm of his own heart. He often found himself reflecting on how much of life he had once spent trying to meet expectations that were never his own. In the mountains, there was no pressure. The land did not judge him, did not demand anything except respect, and he gave that respect willingly. He spent many afternoons working on small repairs around the cabin or crafting tools out of whatever materials he had on hand. Nothing went to waste. He believed that a man should honor what the land gives him by using it well. When he fixed a damaged window frame or stitched a tear in his coat, he did so with a patience that felt like meditation. These tasks were not chores, but offerings to the life he had built. The quiet within the cabin deepened as he worked, broken only by the steady sounds of his tools or the occasional creak of the woods settling outside. Sometimes he would pause and simply listen, letting the stillness wash over him like a tide. Evenings held their own kind of magic. When the light began to fade, the world outside turned into a tapestry of shadows and soft blue hues, and the air grew colder, a kind of clarity that made each breath feel sharper and purer. He would sit by the fire with a mug of tea, watching the flames twist and curl, thinking about nothing and everything at once. He liked to watch how the firelight played across the wooden beams, how the glow made the cabin feel alive in a way that electricity never could. The fire was a presence, a companion that reminded him of his father's stories and the lessons he had learned by sea. It represented warmth, endurance, and the quiet promise that even in the coldest places, light can take root. On certain nights, when the sky was clear enough, he stepped outside and watched the stars with a reverence that bordered on devotion. The northern lights sometimes rippled across the darkness like rivers of green and violet, shifting and dancing. Silence felt holy. He never grew tired of that sight. The lights reminded him of how small and yet how connected he was to the world. They reminded him that beauty often appears in moments of stillness, and the noise has finally faded enough for the heart to recognize it. He also found comfort in routines that others might consider demanding or monotonous. The daily gathering of water from the creek, for instance, was more than a necessity. It was a ritual that grounded him in the landscape. He liked to follow the same path each time, noticing the small changes that marked the passing of days. The creek itself had its own voice, sometimes flowing with a live chatter during the warmer months, sometimes muted beneath thick layers of ice in the winter. He knew its contours, its hidden stones, its sudden shifts in depth, Bringing water back to the cabin felt like participating in an age-old conversation between man and land. When he set out to hunt, he did so with a humility that came from years of understanding his place within the cycle of life. He never hunted more than he needed, and he treated each hunt as a solemn act. The forest demanded patience, awareness, and respect. He moved through it with a quiet step, listening to the soft crackle of snow beneath him, scanning for tracks or distant movement. He believed that taking a life, even for survival, required gratitude. The rifle he had crafted from shipwreck scrap, extension of that belief. It was a tool shaped by his hands, imbued with purpose, and guided not by impulse, but by necessity. He carried it carefully, almost reverently, knowing that it represented a bond between him, the land, and the life he lived. There were days when storms rolled in suddenly, transforming the forest into a blur of wind, snow. During those times, the cabin felt like a fortress of warmth and stillness amid the chaos outside. He would sit near the window, watching the snow whirl in frantic swirls, listening to the wind roar like a living thing. But even then, he felt no fear, no sense of danger. The storms were part of the mountain's language, part of the rhythm he trusted. He had built his life with an understanding that nature would sometimes challenge, bless him, but always teach him. As he moved through each day and each season, the silence around him no longer felt like something he inhabited. It felt like something that inhabited him. It shaped his thought, softened his worries, and allowed him to see life with clarity he never found in crowded places. In the mountain silence, he learned to appreciate small victories, like a fire that caught quickly on a cold morning, or a trail that revealed fresh tracks of a moose moving nearby. He learned to savor the flavor of simple meals, the warmth of the sun breaking through a clouded sky, and the comfort of returning to his cabin after a long walk through the snow. This life that others might call lonely never felt lonely to him. It felt whole, honest, and deeply fulfilling. The solitude gave him room to grow into himself without distraction or compromise. The silence gave him peace. The mountains gave him meaning. And the life he lived there was the truest expression of who he had always been. If everything so far resonates with you, if the stillness of his days and the calm of his mind feel like something you understand or even crave in your own life, then you already share a thread of connection with his world. The moment that would test both the rifle and the man arrived on a day that began so quietly, he almost mistook it for any other in the long winter morning. The air was clear enough to make the distant ridges appear sharper than usual. The snow reflected the pale sunlight in gentle waves that shimmered, brushed silver. He felt well-rested, calm, and connected to the land in a way that often signaled something shifted beneath the surface of day. He tended the fire, warmed his hands, and confident of someone who trusted the rhythm of the mountain as much as his own breath. That morning, he intended only to check the traps he had set 2 nights earlier. It was a simple task, something he had done countless times before, but the mountain often reveals its surprises on the days that seem the most predictable. He slung the rifle over his shoulder with the same respect he always carried, feeling the weight of the polished metal and the strength of the stock resting lightly against his back. Even after weeks of testing and refining, he still admired the way the shipwreck scrap had transformed into a tool capable of shaping destiny. The trail to his trapline ran through a narrow stretch of forest, the kind where the trees stood close together and the light filtered through the branches in thin, trembling lines. He walked slowly, listening to the snow compress beneath his boots, scanning the ground for fresh signs of movement. The silence felt unusually deep that morning, a kind of hush that seemed to settle not only around him but inside him as well. He had learned to pay attention to that sort of silence. It was the silence that comes before a shift, before the world reveals something unexpected. As he moved deeper into the forest, he noticed a faint disturbance in snow near a cluster of spruce trees, the kind of track that did not belong to smaller creatures. The print was large, heavy, and pressed deep into the ground, a sign of power, a sign of presence. He knelt beside the track, resting the rifle gently against his leg as he studied the shape. The claws had pressed sharply into the snow, and the width of the print left no room for doubt. A grizzly had passed through recently, very recently. The cold air still carried a faint, musky scent beneath it, the kind you only notice when your senses are sharpened by years of living close to the land. He rose slowly, scanning the trees, listening for any sound that might reveal the animal's position. He respected grizzlies deeply. They were not creatures to fear, but creatures to honor. Powerful, intelligent, and territorial, they moved with a presence that reminded him of the mountain itself. He knew their habits, their strength, and their unpredictability. Encounters were rare, but always meaningful, like a conversation of force much older and wiser than any man. He continued walking, his steps slower and more deliberate now, the rifle held with a quiet firmness that came from understanding rather than fear. The snow ahead showed more prints, more signs of movement, and he sensed the grizzly was not wandering, but following a path that led closer to his traps. He knew that a hungry bear, particularly in the colder months, could be drawn to the scent of game, and the realization stirred a focused alertness inside him. The forest felt different now, not hostile, but charged with the awareness that he was sharing the same breath, the same ground, with a creature of immense strength. He moved with care, every sense awake. When he reached the small clearing where his first trap was set, he saw the disturbance immediately. Snow was kicked up around the edges, and the trap itself had been torn from its original position, tossed aside as though it weighed nothing. The remains of a hare lay partly buried in the snow, evident the grizzly had taken it. He knelt again, examining the ground, and felt a slow, steady tension build, not fear, but recognition. He knew the bear was still close. The silence around him thickened, the kind of silence that feels like held breath. He rose carefully, every movement measured, and scanned the line of trees that formed the boundary of the clearing. That when he saw it, a shape shifting between the shadows, a massive form moving with a deliberate heaviness that made the ground seem to absorb the weight. The grizzly stepped into view, its fur thick and dark, its shoulders rolling with a power that commanded respect. The bear lifted its head, sniffing the air, its small eyes catching the faint glint of the morning light. For a moment, man and animal simply studied each other, not as enemies, but as two beings sharing the same space, each aware of the other's presence, strength, and right to exist. The bear was not displaying aggression, but it was also not retreating. It stood its ground with the unyielding confident creature that had survived countless winters. He understood then that the encounter was not about fear or dominance. It was about balance. The grizzly was hungry, driven by the instinct to survive. He was standing in a place the bear considered part of its territory. The tension between them was natural, ancient, and deeply rooted in the laws of the wilderness. He slowly raised the rifle, not because he wanted to harm the bear, but because he respected the danger of the moment. The mountain had taught him that hesitation in the face of necessity could cost a life. And the rifle he had crafted from shipwreck scrap was not a trophy, but a tool meant for moments exactly like this, a tool that required clarity, calm, and purpose. The bear took a slow step forward, sniffing the air again, its breath visible in the cold as small cloud mist. The ground seemed to hold its breath. The trees stood silent, and in that stillness he understood the truth of the moment. This was not a fight. It was a test of his instincts, his craftsmanship, and the harmony he had built with the land. He steadied his breathing, tightened his grip on the rifle, and aimed with the calm focus that only years of solitude could sharpen. When the bear stepped closer, lowering its head slightly as if assessing him, he knew the moment had come. The muzzle crack echoed through the forest like a shock wave of thunder. The recoil felt strong but balanced, perfectly aligned with the design he had spent so long refining. The shot was true, the kind that comes only from instinct honed by respect. The grizzly staggered, let out a deep groan that seemed to tremble through the air, and fell to the snow with a quiet heaviness that felt more like feet. He stood there for a long moment, breathing slowly, the rifle lowered now, the silence settling around him again. The bear lay still, its powerful form resting in the cold embrace of the forest. He approached carefully, not with triumph, but with gratitude. A life taken in the wilderness is never a victory. It is a necessity, honored with humility. He knelt beside the bear and placed a hand near its shoulder, feeling the warmth still lingering in the thick fur. He whispered a quiet word of thanks, not out of ritual, but out of genuine respect for the creature that had tested him and the rifle that had proven itself worthy. As he worked to salvage what the bear had offered, he reflected on the meaning of the moment. The rifle had not simply functioned. It had fulfilled the purpose he had crafted it for. The shipwreck scrap that once lay forgotten beneath frost and salt had been reborn into something that protected his life. But more than that, the encounter reminded him of the balance he lived within. The mountain gave, and the mountain demanded. The wilderness rewarded patience, awareness, and respect, and he had learned to meet those demands with steady hands and a calm. When he finally began the long walk back to his cabin, carrying what he could and planning to return for the rest, the rifle rested across his shoulder with a new kind of weight, not heavier, but filled with meaning. Each step felt like a confirmation of his choices, his skills, and the bond he shared with the land. The grizzly would provide meat, hide, bone, nothing wasted, everything on. And the rifle forged remains of a shipwreck written in snow. That if you are still here listening to this journey, let this moment remind you every challenge carries a lesson and every test reveals something new about who we are. And if the story continues to speak to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next steps of this path. He returned to his cabin that evening with a calmness that seemed to rise naturally from the deep places inside him, the kind of calm that comes only after standing face to face and walking away deeper understanding of one's. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he followed the familiar path home, the light beginning to fade into the muted colors of early dusk. He carried part of the bear's weight with him on that first trip, not out of any rush, but out of respect for what the animal had. He would return for the rest at dawn, when the cold sharpened the air and the forest still held the clarity of morning. As he approached the cabin, the faint glow from the small window greeted him like an old friend, a reminder that even in the vastness of the wilderness, there were places of warmth and meaning. The door creaked lightly as he stepped inside, and the familiar scent of pine smoke and worn leather wrapped around him like a comforting cloak. He set down what he carried and sat for a long moment near the stove, letting the warmth seep slowly in. The cabin was quiet, except for the steady breathing of the fire, a sound he had come to appreciate as deeply as some men appreciate music. The events of the day rested on his mind with a weight that did not feel heavy, but thoughtful. He replayed the moment when the grizzly had stepped into the clearing, the powerful presence of the animal, the deep understanding that flowed between them, and the clarity with which he had acted. It was not pride he felt, but gratitude. Gratitude for the life he had taken, gratitude for the rifle that had proven its worth, and gratitude for the mountain that continued to shape his days with purpose. He understood that moments like these were just encounters, but teaching, reminders of the delicate balance he lived within. Later that night, after preparing a simple meal and tending to the gear he had used, he sat by the fire with a quiet mind. The flames moved slowly, their glow reflecting in his eyes as he stared into them with the same calm curiosity he often had when studying the ridges or the stars. The fire held its own kind of wisdom, ancient and patient, and he had always believed that a man could learn something from watching its dance. As he reflected on the encounter with the grizzly, he realized that the mountain had revealed another part of him he had always felt but had never fully named. It was not just the strength to face danger or the skill to survive. It was the acceptance of responsibility. Responsibility for the land, for the creatures he hunted, for the choices he made, and for the life he had chosen so deliberately. This responsibility was not a burden to him, but a calling, something that filled him with purpose. He slept deeply that night, the kind of sleep that comes only after a day lived with intention. When he woke before dawn, the cabin was still dark, but the fire had left enough warmth in the room to make rising comfortable. He added wood to the stove, watched the flames catch, and prepared himself for the walk back to retrieve the rest of the bear. The air outside was colder than the day before, crisp enough to sting slightly at his cheeks, but he welcomed cold air. He believed cleared the mind. The sky was beginning to lighten with soft shades of blue and gray as he set out, the rifle strapped across his back, not out of fear, but as a natural extension of his presence in the wilderness. The return journey to the clearing felt almost ceremonial. The forest was still, the branches weighed down with thin layers of frost that sparkled faintly in the early morning light. His breath formed small clouds in front of him, drifting briefly or disappearing in the cold. When he reached the spot where the bear lay, the snow around the animal frozen slightly, preserving the moment with a kind of solemn dignity. He stood silently for a few breaths before working, the same quiet acknowledgment he offered every life the wilderness provided him. He took what he needed with care, knowing that nothing would be wasted. Every part of the animal would serve a purpose, from the meat that would sustain him through the winter to the hide that would provide warmth and the bones that could be fashioned into tools. This was the agreement he lived by, the understanding that defined his relationship with the land. As he worked, he noticed the marks his boots made in the snow, alongside the deep imprints left by the bear. The contrast between them struck him as symbolic. His steps were deliberate, human, grounded in thought and intention. The bear's tracks were powerful, instinctive, rooted in something ancient and wild, yet both existed side by side in the same forest, crossing paths in ways that felt almost predetermined. He had learned long ago that the wilderness was full of encounters, each one revealing something different, the nature of life, and the place each creature held within it. By the time he finished gathering everything he could carry, the sun had risen fully above the treetops, casting long shadows across the clearing. He returned home with a steady pace, feeling the weight of the bear balanced perfectly against his back. Inside the cabin, he began the slow work of preparing the meat, preserving what he needed and storing it carefully. This work required patience and attention, but he found deep satisfaction. It was the kind of task that reminded him of the rhythms he lived within, the cycle, giving and receiving, of taking and honoring. As he worked, he thought about how much his life had changed since he first arrived in these mountains. He thought about the noise he had left behind, the clutter of thought and expectations that had once filled his mind. Here, there was only clarity. Here, each action felt connected to something larger than himself. By midday, the cabin was filled with the scent of cooking meat, a scent that carried warmth and promise through the air. He paused in his work to step outside, letting the cold air wash briefly over him, the forest around him peaceful and full of subtle signs that the day was settling in its rhythm. He walked a short distance to where the trees opened, offering a broad view of the distant peak. He stood there for a moment, taking in the sight of the mountains rising silently into the sky. They looked unchanged, eternal, their vastness reminding him once again of the scale of the world. And yet, standing there, he felt no smallness. Instead, he felt anchored, grounded, connected to everything around him in a way that filled him with a sense of purpose too deep for words. As the afternoon deepened, he continued the work of preparing what the Grizzly had provided. Each movement was calm, steady, and intentional. He knew that many people in the world hurried through their days, rushing to complete tasks, chasing goals that left them exhausted and unsatisfied. But here, time felt different. It stretched and breathed with him, allowing each action to unfold naturally. He often reflected on the idea the world outside the mountains seemed to forget that life could be simple, purposeful, and deeply fulfilling. He had not forgotten, and later never would. When the work was finally done and the cabin once again carried the soft glow of firelight, he sat with a deep sense of fulfillment. The rifle rested against the wall near him, its polished surface catching the fire's reflection. He looked at it with a kind of admiration, usually reserved for old friends. It had proven itself not just as a tool, but as a testament to his ability to create something meaningful from what others would discard. That rifle represented resilience, transformation, and the profound connection between a man and the life he shaped with his own hands. As he sat in the quiet, he found himself thinking about the world beyond the mountain, the people living fast lives filled with noise and urgency. He wondered how many of them had forgotten the truth he had spent years learning. That peace does not come from comfort or convenience, but from understanding who you are and where you belong. That clarity grows in silence, in solitude, in moments of challenge and reflection. That the world has a way of teaching us when we are willing to listen. But most people never hear the lessons because they surround themselves with distraction. He did not judge them. He simply wished they could feel, even for a moment, the calmness he felt now. The day slowly faded into night, the sky growing darker, cold deepening outside the cabin wall. He added another log to the fire and leaned back in his chair, staring into the flames with a peaceful gaze. The encounter with the Grizzly would stay with him, not as a story of danger or triumph, but as a reminder of the balance he lived, a reminder that life in the mountain was not meant to be easy, but meant to be real. And real things leave marks on us, shaping us in ways we carry deeply. As he rested, the forest outside shifted slightly, the wind brushing against the cabin with a soft sigh. It felt almost like the mountain acknowledging the day, recognizing the choices he had made, offering its own quiet companionship. In that moment, he felt more connected to the world than he ever had when surrounded by people. He felt part of something vast, honest, and eternal. If this journey continues to resonate with you, if the reflections and strength of this life speak to something inside you, you are already sharing the solitude and the wisdom he found in these mountains. The nights that followed the encounter with the Grizzly were calm in a way that seemed to reach deeper than usual, as if the mountain itself were acknowledging the balance that had been honored. He felt it each time he stepped outside to breathe the cold air or gather a handful of snow to melt for water. There was a stillness in the trees, a softness in the wind, a quiet presence that moved with him as naturally as his own shadow. Life returned to its familiar rhythm, but something inside him, not in a way that pulled him away from solitude or changed who he, in a quiet, almost imperceptible way, deepened his understanding of what it meant to live in harmony with the wilderness. He had always believed that taught lesson felt another, a responsibility, quiet legacy a man chooses. In the days that followed, he continued his routines with the same care as always. He tended the fire in the mornings, prepared his meals slowly, repaired anything that needed mending, and walked the forest with the sense of ease that came from knowing he was exactly where he belonged. The rifle rested in its place near the wall, not as a trophy, but as a tool that had proven its worth. He kept it clean, polished, and ready, not out of paranoia, but out of respect. Everything in his cabin had a purpose. Every object held meaning. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was excessive. He lived in a world where simplicity was not a lack, but a richness that filled each day with clarity. As the weeks passed, the weather began to shift. The deep cold of winter softened, giving way to hints of early thaw. The trees shed small drops of melting frost, and the air carried the faint scent of wet earth beneath the lingering snow. He knew the change of season was coming, not because he counted days or watched calendars, but because he felt the shift the same way he felt hunger or fatigue. The wilderness spoke in subtle signals, and he had long since learned how to listen. He welcomed the change, not as escape from winter, but as part of the cycle he changed. Each season offered its own challenge, its own beauty, its own rhythm, and he welcomed all of them. During those early days of thaw, he spent more time outside, walking further into the forest, exploring the places where the snow had thinned enough to reveal patches of earth and old tracks preserved beneath the ice. The silence of winter softened just enough to let new sounds emerge. The distant drip of water from melting branches, the subtle creak of ice shifting on the river, the soft flutter of wings from birds returning slow, cautious flight. These sounds were not loud or dramatic, but to him they were reminders that life in the wilderness moved in cycles larger than any single day or season. They reminded him that even in solitude, he was part of something vast and continuous. He often found himself stopping along his walks to simply stand and breathe. He would lean lightly on a fallen log or rest his hand against the trunk of an old spruce and let the world settle around. In those moments, he felt the kind of peace that does not demand attention or celebration. It was the peace of belonging, the peace of understanding oneself so deeply that no storm or hardship could shake the foundation within. This peace did not come from the absence of struggle, but from acceptance of it. He knew the winters would always return with their harsh winds and heavy snows. He knew seasons of scarcity would follow seasons of abundance. He knew the mountains could be calm one moment and unforgiving the next. But he embraced all of it because each challenge had shaped him into the man he had become. Sometimes, in the quiet of his cabin, he reflected on how different his life was from the one he had known before coming to the mountain, not in a way that stirred regret, because he carried no regret, but in a way that revealed just how far he had come. He remembered the noise, the expectation, the constant pressure to keep pace with a world that moved too fast for him. He remembered the sense of disconnection he felt even when he was surrounded by people, the feeling that he was walking a path that belonged to someone else's story. Those memories felt distant now, like echoes fading across a wide valley. They were part of his past, but they no longer held any power over him. He had chosen a different life, one that felt honest and true, and he knew with complete certainty that he would never trade it for anything else. His reflections often led him to think about the nature of happiness. Many people chase happiness as though it were something to be captured, a prize waiting at the end of effort or achievement. But he had learned that happiness is not something it was something to cultivate, something that grew from living in alignment with one's own nature. Happiness was found in the small things, the warmth of the fire on a cold night, the taste of a simple meal prepared with care, the sight of a distant mountain peak illuminated by the morning sun, the satisfaction of crafting something useful with his own hand, the quiet companionship of silence. For him, happiness was not an emotion, but a way of being, a steady state of contentment woven into the fabric of his life. As spring slowly approached, he began preparing his tools and supplies for the tasks that would come with the thaw. He checked the condition of his fishing gear, repaired weak spots in his boots, ensured his cabin roof was ready for the melting, and organized his storage space for the new season provision. He worked with same defined. There was no rush. Time moved with not again. And as he worked, he often caught himself smiling softly at the quiet beauty of the day. He knew that many might see his life as difficult, but to him it was a life of abundance, not abundance of things, but abundance of purpose and clarity. On one particular afternoon, as he sat outside on a wooden stool repairing a fishing lure, he looked out at the stretch of forest before him and felt a deep sense of legacy settle over his thought. Not legacy in the sense of fame or remembrance, because he cared for neither. His legacy was something quieter, something woven into the land itself, a legacy built through the choices he made every day, through the respect he showed the wilderness, through the way he lived simply, honestly, and without pretense. He believed that a man's legacy not defined by how many people remembered his name, but by how deeply he lived his truth. And in that sense, his legacy was strong. It was carried in the trees he walked among, in the trails he maintained, in the animals he honored, and in the quiet he cultivated inside himself. As the days grew longer and the cold softened into the first hints of warmth, he found himself spending more time reflecting on the connection between his life and the world beyond the mountain. Not because he missed that world, but because he understood that many people who heard his story might be looking for something they had forgotten how to name, something he had once forgotten too. He knew that there were people who felt the same pull he had once, people who longed for stillness, clarity, for a life that made sense in a deeper way, people who felt out of place in the noise, people who yearned for a sense of belonging that could not be found in crowded places or busy routines. He hoped, in his own quiet way, that his story might remind them peace was not something rare or unreachable. It was simply something they had to choose, something they had to create. He did not believe that everyone needed to move to the mountains to find themselves. The mountains were his path, not the only path. But he believed that everyone needed a place where they could listen to their own voice, interference, a place where the noise of the world softened enough for the heart to speak clearly. For some, that place might be a forest. For others, a quiet room, a long walk, a moment alone. The form did not matter. What mattered was the silence. What mattered was the choice to listen. As spring finally took hold and the last traces of snow began to disappear from the forest floor, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The mountain did not change who he was. It revealed who he had always been. And now, with the passing of another winter and the arrival of new life, he felt that truth more deeply than ever. He stood outside his cabin one evening. The sun dipped behind a ridge, casting long shadows across the land, and he breathed in the cool air with a steady, peaceful. He felt gratitude for the land, for the lessons, the challenge, quiet, for the life he had built with his own two hands, a story that continued to unfold, not with dramatic twists or grand moments, but with the steady rhythm of a life lived fully. And if this story has spoken to you, if the quiet strength and the calm truth of his journey have resonated with something inside you, I invite you to let me know in the comments how this tale reached. And if you have found value in this journey, consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing this story with someone who might need to hear it. Your presence here matters, and your support helps keep these stories alive.